This is something that just happened in January. In Bali, there was a really huge tidal surge and a huge mass grave of people that were killed in the communist purges of 65 to 66 was suddenly made visible. Like, just bodies everywhere. And all along the beaches in Bali, where there are now, really fancy resorts, underneath them, there are more mass graves. So sooner or later, they're going to come to light. If it's in 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, and like the Khmer Rouge period in Cambodia, the Indonesian government doesn't teach about 65 to 66 in school. So, people, okay, those of you who have been to Cambodia and those of you who are going to go, you know this. If you ask someone under the age of 20 about the Khmer Rouge period, many of them don't believe it actually happened. Because it's not taught, their parents never talk about it, nobody knows. It wasn't until David Chandler's History of Cambodia that was translated into Khmer in 2007 that people actually had a chance to read some kind of objective historical appraisal of what happened during those years. This is why historians are important. So in 40 years, when school kids are wondering why bodies are washing up on their beach, historians will be able to tell them. But if we're not allowed access or nobody cares about it as an actual historical problem, then we won't know. Incidentally, the Indonesian government doesn't like giving people permission to interview survivors of the purges. Women, I could say more about the fact that communist women were rounded up and persecuted because it was believed that the communist women who had killed the 7 generals generally mutilated them and performed, bizarre rites with their severed genitals. And so communist women all over Indonesia were rounded up and put in jail, like thousands of them for 40 years or more, and weren't allowed out until very recently, and they're still not allowed to talk to anybody about it. Okay, just in the remaining, this is something I'm working on right now. I'm going to Oxford University for a conference in March, at which I'm going to talk about a couple of sort of combined things. One is this is the communal violence that I want to sort of address in those 5 categories. But there's something more than that as well. There's also the legacy of applying, and I talk about this a lot in my classes, the problem with applying Western notions of sovereignty on non-Western places is that you put hard and fast lines on a map, but you don't think about whether the people who are affected by this line get to have any say in it or what it means for their own identity. And so I'm talking about the Muslims in Arakan. You'll see them in the news right now as the Rohingya, which isn't a real name, it's a made-up name. So that's the first thing. And this violence in Rakhine State in Burma is very much contextualized by the media as Rohingya Muslims versus Rakhine Buddhists. And it's actually not like that at all. The government basically hasn't really done anything about this. In Rakhine State, by the way, Rakhine is Arakan. Arakan was only absorbed into the Burmese Empire in 1784, okay? So it's not like it's a long-standing part of Burma. The Arakanese, Muslim and Buddhist combined, never wanted Burma to take over. They've always been sort of independent. So it's been in the interest of the Burmese state between 1784 and 1824 to get the people living in Arakan to not collectively do anything together, right? So it's been in their interest to keep people separate, Buddhists and Muslims separate. So they live in slightly different villages, different areas, different sections of town. They have mosques, they have pagodas, etc. They also have different kind of economic activities. So the Muslims are generally fisher folk, whereas the Buddhists generally are rice farmers. Okay, so they've got different economic interests as well. From the middle of 2012, there was escalating violence, which was kicked off when a bunch of supposedly Muslim Rakhine dwellers raped a Buddhist woman. Now, my response to this at the time was rapists are just rapists. It doesn't, Muslims aren't naturally inclined to be rapists and Buddhists aren't naturally inclined to be victims. And a lot of things had happened the other way around. But there's always been tension in Arakan between people who have lived in Arakan forever and state agents of the Burmese junta, okay? So it's in the interest of the Burmese government to incite situations in which the Muslims and the Burmese Buddhists, the Arakanese Buddhists, are placed at loggerheads. So what happened was a whole series of things occurred that may or may not have been instigated by the Burmese government itself, state agents, in which the Muslims living in Rakhine State were persecuted. This is a state soldier standing at the entry to a mosque in Arakan. Muslims in Arakan, as they have done throughout history, began fleeing towards Bangladesh on the other side of the border. Okay, so this is Rakhine, this is Bangladesh here. This area here, it looks kind of ashy, right? It looks like it's been burnt. This is the Muslim quarter of Sittwe in Rakhine State. Only the Muslim area caught fire. Okay, this was not an accident. People jumped into the sea or got in their boats, and 7,000 or 8,000 people left for Bangladesh immediately. Because historically, if there's trouble in Bangladesh, people flee towards Arakan. If there's trouble in Arakan, people flee towards Bangladesh. Okay, this is historical. What has happened now is that the Burmese government does not want to allow the Muslims who have fled Arakan to come back, and the Bangladeshis don't want to accept them. The Burmese government says they're not residents of Burma, they're not Burmese citizens. And if you look at the Burmese citizenship law, it says that Shans are citizens of Burma, you have Mons who are citizens of Burma, Karen, Black Karen, Karenni. Almost every other ethnic minority group in Burma is considered to be a citizen because they've been there forever. They say that the Arakanese Muslims are not because they're Indians, and Indians only came into Burma after the first Anglo-Burman War. So if you can prove that your family was resident in Arakan before 1824, then sure, you can have citizenship. But if you can't prove that, then no, it means you're Bangladeshi and you have to go back to Bangladesh. Whereas Bangladesh, which is not known for being a country with lots of resources to expend on its own people, let alone hundreds of thousands of refugees, say, well, they're not Bangladeshi either, they don't even speak our language, what do you want us to do with them? And so it's a really huge humanitarian crisis, all predicated on the fact that nobody can produce a birth certificate that says, I was born in Sittwe in 1823. How many of you could produce documentation to substantiate the notion that you deserve to be here, going back to 1824? What kind could you produce? A birth certificate from your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather? I'd be willing to believe it, but I don't think more than like 2 people in the entire room could prove that.
My family fought in the Revolutionary War.
But were they born here?
Afterwards. Yeah.
No, but they born here. Were they born here and then fought in the Revolutionary War? Could you produce a document to that effect? Could you produce a birth certificate? A ship manifest saying that they came over on this ship?
No.
No. It's a ridiculous thing to expect anyone to produce. And the other thing is they can't even say, well, my father or my grandfather was born in Arakan, because the state doesn't allow them to register births. And the reason you can't register a birth if you're a Muslim in Rakhine State is because you're considered illegitimate unless you have a marriage certificate. But you only get a marriage certificate in Arakan if you get married in a Buddhist ceremony at a pagoda, because only the officiating monks are given the paperwork. So if you get married in a Muslim nikah, you don't get the paperwork. So what are you supposed to do? So they made it impossible for any Muslim in Rakhine State to be a citizen. Historians, however, Jack Leiter, myself, and a linguist at the University of Chicago are proving linguistically and through iconography that the Buddhist leaders of Arakan, before the Burmese invaded and took over, that they were using Muslim reign names, even though they were Buddhists themselves. So we're trying to prove that there was this long-standing tradition of Muslims being in Arakan and being valued members of the government, of the court, etc. And so that this might be an argument for allowing Muslim citizenship in Rakhine. Okay, so those are just a couple of instances, but you can see that an awareness of historical legacies of conflict and the reasons that they occur can play a really important part in overcoming some of the obstacles that face fragile states. Burma is one of the most fragile. I'm just going to end on this kind of propaganda note. All of the Muslims have been living in these areas here, and this is exactly where the big pipeline is going through from China through to the port in Rakhine State. So they've been moved for a reason, and you know, it may become a very important part of my future research agenda to prove that this is why the state incited violence against Muslims and basically stirred up communal violence between Buddhists and Muslims just to drive the Muslims out so that they could implement the pipeline plan. Thank you very much for your attention.